The house sat on the edge of a quiet road, a little distance from the nearest town, with enough land around it to feel peaceful, but not so much that it felt lonely. The man who lived there had moved in only 6 months earlier, hoping to rebuild a slower and calmer life after years of living in fast, crowded neighborhoods where he never really felt at ease. This place felt different from the moment he arrived. It had a wide porch, tall trees, clear air, and neighbors who waved when they passed by. He liked that. He liked the quiet and the sense that he could finally breathe without thinking about city sirens or crowded streets. Most days were slow and simple. He spent mornings fixing things around the house, afternoons walking along the dirt road, and evenings sitting on the porch with a warm drink as the sun drifted behind the trees. Nothing dramatic happened here, and that was exactly why he chose it. But life has a way of shifting suddenly, especially when people show up with the wrong intentions. The first time he saw the unfamiliar truck, he didn't think much of it. Old pickups and small utility trucks passed by all the time, some hauling lumber, others loaded with equipment for nearby farms. But this truck slowed down as it approached his gate. It didn't stop, and the people inside didn't roll down a window or wave, but the way they stared made him pause. 2 men sat inside, both wearing shirts that looked like uniforms, though not the type I would see from real officials. Their shirts had words printed on them, but from the porch he couldn't make out what they said. He didn't worry at first. Maybe he was being overly cautious, but the next day the same truck returned. This time it stopped near the end of his driveway. It sat there for several seconds, engine running. One of the men leaned out the window and looked toward the porch, scanning the property like he was checking for something. Only after a long moment did they pull away and continue down the road. He watched them leave, a slight uneasy feeling stirring in his chest. It wasn't fear, just confusion mixed with a sense that something wasn't right. People didn't usually behave like that in this area. Neighbors respected privacy. Strangers didn't linger unless they needed directions or help. He tried to brush it off. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were checking an address for a delivery. He didn't want to jump to conclusions based on a truck and 2 unfamiliar men. But 3 days later, the situation changed. That morning started like any other. Birds were chirping, the air was cool, and a soft breeze brushed through the tall grass. He had stepped outside to water a few plants near the side of the house when he heard the sound of tires crunching slowly on gravel. He looked up and saw not 1 but 2 trucks rolling toward his property. Both stopped by the gate. 4 men stepped out, each wearing the same type of shirt he had seen earlier. Now he could read the words clearly: HOA Enforcement Patrol. He blinked in disbelief. HOA? Out here? His home wasn't part of any neighborhood organization. In fact, the entire area consisted of independent properties. People here chose the freedom of no HOA for a reason. The idea that anyone would show up claiming otherwise felt strange. The men didn't hesitate. They walked through the open gate as if they already owned the place. He didn't appreciate that. He placed the watering can down, wiped his hands, and calmly approached the front of the yard. The man in front looked like he considered himself the leader. He held a clipboard under one arm and a small badge clipped to his shirt. The badge looked plastic and cheaply made, like something ordered online morning. The man said, scanning the house with his eyes as if taking inventory, "We're here to inspect the property for recent violations." The homeowner looked at them with a calm but puzzled expression. Violations? What violations? This area doesn't have an HOA. The man smirked as if he expected that answer. This area falls under our expanded oversight now. New policies, new boundaries. Just routine inspection. It's not possible, he replied. There is no HOA here. I checked all documents before I bought this place. The leader waved a dismissive hand. The documents are probably outdated. We're establishing new regulations to improve neighborhood standards. Now we'll need access around the house. The homeowner shook his head firmly. No, you won't. You're on private property. You need to leave. The leader's expression tightened. The men standing behind him shifted slightly, their eyes cold, their shirts stiff and tucked in too neatly for regular workers. Something about their posture felt rehearsed, not natural. We aren't leaving, the leader said. We're doing our job. If you refuse to cooperate, you'll receive fines. fines, routine inspection, expanding oversight. Everything about their wording felt rehearsed, like they'd said it dozens of times to other people. He studied them more carefully. The trucks had no official markings. The badges looked fake. The uniforms looked more like costumes than real authority attire. He wasn't naive. He had dealt with enough people in his life to understand the difference between someone with real authority and someone pretending to have it. And these men were pretending. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use threats. He simply spoke with the same calm tone he had carried his whole life. This is private property. I didn't agree to any HOA, and you're trespassing. Leave now. The leader chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. Sir, we can fine you for refusing inspection. We can increase those fines daily if needed. No, he said again. You can't, and you need to step back off my property. One of the men behind the leader took a slow step forward, as if trying to intimidate him. But the homeowner didn't flinch. He stood steady, shoulders relaxed, posture calm. Let me make this clear, he said. You all need to leave. There is no HOA here. You have no authority over me or this property, the leader scoffed. We'll be back, he said with a cold smile. This isn't over, he didn't respond. He simply remained still, watching as they finally turned around, climbed back into their trucks, and drove away slowly, their eyes lingering on him as they left the property. The moment they disappeared down the road, the yard felt different. Not unsafe, but disturbed, as if the peaceful rhythm of the place had been interrupted by something that didn't belong. He didn't like that feeling. He didn't want strangers showing up pretending to have control over the homes here. And he didn't want neighbors being confused or scared by people claiming authority they didn't actually have. He stood there for a long while, thinking about the encounter. Who were those men? Why did they choose this area? How many people had they approached before him? Were they truly trying to act like an HOA? Or were they part of something else entirely? He didn't have answers yet, but what he did know was simple. They would be back, just as they said. And next time, he needed to be ready with more than just words. Later that day, he spoke with a few neighbors. He walked down the dirt road, stopping by familiar houses where people sat on porches or worked in yards. Each person he talked to reacted with the same confusion. No one had heard of any new HOA. No one had been notified about changes. But as he spoke with more people, he learned something troubling. He wasn't the first to see the fake patrol. An elderly couple living 2 houses away said a similar group had shown up a few weeks earlier. They had taken pictures of the couple's yard, talked about mandatory maintenance standards, and left a notice demanding a payment. The couple had been too confused and frightened to argue. They just wanted the men to leave. When he asked if they had paid anything, the couple nodded sadly. They'd handed over money just to avoid trouble. Another neighbor shared that the same group had been seen near the road, looking into different properties and talking among themselves. No one had questioned them, thinking it might be some county inspection team. But now the truth seemed clear. The group wasn't official. They were targeting rural homes, especially older residents, hoping people wouldn't question their authority. By the time the sun lowered, he'd spoken with enough people to understand the pattern. The fake patrol didn't pick homes at random. They picked quiet areas, places where real officials rarely came. They showed up dressed just convincingly enough to confuse people, hoping someone would believe their story. And once someone believed them, they could pressure or scare them into paying. He didn't like bullies. He especially didn't like people who took advantage of the elderly or those who didn't know how to challenge false authority. The more he learned, the more determined he became to stop it. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sky fade into dusk, he replayed the encounter in his mind. He remembered the smirk on the leader's face, the cheap badge dangling to the side, the way the men behaved like they expected him to cave. They had probably dealt with enough frightened homeowners to think everyone would simply accept their demands. But he wasn't frightened, and he wasn't alone. The neighbors trusted him, even if they didn't say it out loud. They needed someone willing to stand up and question things. The quiet road felt peaceful again. But now, there was something else beneath the surface. Purpose. Not anger, not fear. Just a firm understanding that if those men returned, He would be ready to protect his property the right way, without violence, without losing control, and without letting anyone scare him into silence. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew the story wasn't over, not even close. And if the fake patrol thought they could push him the same way they pushed others, they were mistaken, because he was done ignoring the problem, and he was ready for whatever came next. The next few days passed slowly, but not in the peaceful way the man was used to. Something in the air felt unsettled, as if the ground itself was waiting for the next move. Even the usual sounds of the countryside, the wind pushing through the tall grass, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of a tractor felt different. The fake HOA patrol had left a mark on the place without even doing anything physical. It was the idea of them, the intrusion, that bothered him. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. The way the men walked through the gate without hesitation, the forced confidence in their voices, the cheap badges pinned to their shirts. He didn't like the thought of people pretending to have authority and using that act to scare others. It wasn't just wrong. It felt personal, because he cared about the people here. This community had welcomed him quietly, without demands or expectations. And now someone was trying to threaten that sense of peace. One evening he sat on his porch once again, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The sun dipped low, touching the tops of trees and stretching shadows across the yard. He knew he had to do something more than just wait. If the fake patrol returned Dan, he was certain he couldn't just stand alone. The neighbors needed to know what was really happening. They needed someone to bring everything together. He decided that the next morning he would talk to more people. He wanted to know how far this fake group had gone, how many homes they had visited, whether anyone else had been pressured into paying. He needed to understand the full picture. The next day, he walked down the dirt road, stopping by each house. The neighbors were friendly and open, but their faces changed the moment he mentioned the fake HOA patrol. Some became worried, their brows tightening. Others became frustrated, talking about how the group had made them feel bullied or confused. A few simply looked tired, as if they had accepted the situation because they didn't know what else to do. One neighbor, a middle-aged man who lived in a small farmhouse with a big vegetable garden, said the fake patrol had approached him 3 times. They always used the same lines: new regulations, expanded oversight, routine inspections. The neighbor hadn't believed them fully, but admitted he didn't want conflict, so he pretended to cooperate until they left. Another neighbor said the group had taken pictures of her yard without permission. She told them to stop, but they ignored her, claiming they were allowed to document violations. When she insisted they leave, they warned her that fines would be added to her account. She had never signed anything with them, but their tone made her nervous, and they seemed so sure of their authority that she doubted herself. The most heartbreaking story came from an older woman who lived alone. She told them the group had pressured her into giving them money, saying it was an initial enrollment fee. She didn't want trouble, especially not at her age, so she paid. She handed them money simply to make them go away. When she realized they were not real, the shame and frustration sat in her eyes like a heavy weight. The homeowner listened carefully to each person, making mental notes of everything they shared. By the time he returned to his porch that afternoon, he understood that the problem was bigger than he expected. The fake patrol wasn't just bothering 1 or 2 homes. They had worked their way through most of the road, acting confident, pushing people into silence, using fear disguised as authority. He didn't like bullies. He didn't like seeing good people being forced into uncomfortable situations. And he definitely didn't like the idea of strangers pretending to have control over a community that didn't belong to them. He sat on the porch thinking through everything. The breeze was steady, the trees rustled gently, but his mind was restless. He knew he couldn't fight these people alone. He also knew that waiting for them to appear again without a plan would only make things worse. He needed a way for the community to stand together. That's when he remembered something important. People listened better when they could gather, talk face to face, and share experiences. If everyone realized they weren't alone, the fear these fake enforcers used would lose its power. No scam worked when everyone was informed. Information was protection. That night, he began visiting homes again, but this time he had a clear purpose. He asked each neighbor if they would be willing to meet at his place the next afternoon, just to talk openly about what was happening. He made sure to speak gently, not pushing anyone, just explaining how important it was for everyone to be on the same page. Most neighbors agreed without hesitation. A few looked hesitant at first, but eventually said yes after hearing that others were joining too. The next day, people arrived slowly, some walking, some driving their old pickup trucks, some pushing bikes. They gathered in his yard, forming a loose circle under the shade of trees. It wasn't a formal meeting. No one had titles or speeches prepared. It was just a group of residents sharing a common problem. He didn't stand in the center or take charge like a leader. Instead, he sat among them and began by explaining his encounter with the fake patrol. The neighbors nodded, murmuring quietly as he described how the men had acted so boldly, how they had walked through the gate without permission, how they kept insisting on authority they didn't have. After he spoke, others began sharing their experiences. The older woman who had been pressured into paying told her story with a shaky voice. The neighbor with the vegetable garden talked about how the patrol kept returning to his place. People listened closely, some shaking their heads, some whispering in disbelief. The more stories were shared, the clearer the truth became. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a planned effort to push fear into the community. When everyone had spoken, a silence settled over the group. It wasn't a sad silence. It was a silence of understanding. Suddenly, they weren't scattered individuals dealing with a confusing situation. They were a group, a community. People standing together. Someone asked, "What do we do now?" He thought about it before answering. First, we don't panic. And we don't let them scare us. They pretend to have authority because people give them that power. If we stop giving them that power, their plan falls apart. Another neighbor added, "We should document everything. Photos, videos, notes about when they come around," someone else said, "and maybe we should report them as a group. The sheriff's office might take it more seriously if it's from all of us." He nodded. Yes, that's a good idea. The meeting continued for almost an hour. People exchanged numbers, promised to keep each other informed, and agreed to watch out for any unusual activity. Even the quietest neighbors, the ones who usually kept to themselves, spoke up and offered help. It was surprising how quickly everyone bonded when faced with a common challenge. By the time the group began to leave, the man felt something he hadn't felt since the fake patrol first arrived: hope. The situation was still unresolved, and the men pretending to be an HOA could show up again at any moment. But now the community wasn't caught off guard. They were prepared, unified, and informed. That evening, he sat on the porch once more. The sun was setting, casting warm colors across the yard. The air felt lighter, as if the burden had lifted slightly. But deep inside, he knew the fake patrol wouldn't give up easily. People who acted with such confidence rarely backed down after the first attempt. They would return, likely angrier, maybe more determined. But now, he wasn't facing them alone. Just before night settled in completely, he heard a sound in the distant stires on gravel. His heart tensed a little, but when he looked out toward the road, he was relieved to see it was just one of the neighbors driving by, checking on others before heading home. Community mattered. It created a kind of quiet strength no bully could break easily. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he found himself thinking about the fake patrol. He wondered who they were, why they had chosen this area, and how long they had been doing this. He wondered how many other neighborhoods they had intimidated, and how many people had fallen for their act. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that this wasn't just about his home or his neighbors. It was about making sure no one else got hurt the way the older woman had been. Paying money out of fear. He fell asleep with a strange mix of determination and caution. He didn't want trouble. He wasn't looking for a fight. But he refused to let anyone take advantage of the community he had come to admire. The next morning started quietly. He did his usual routine coffee, a slow walk around the property, a check of the fence line. For a moment, things almost felt normal again. But sometimes the calm moments are just the space before something else happens. In the early afternoon, he heard engines approaching. Not fast, not loud, but steady. He walked to the porch and stood still, waiting for the trucks to appear. And when they did, rolling down the dirt road in the same slow, deliberate way as before, he knew exactly who it was. The fake HOA patrol had returned, and this time, he was ready. The trucks rolled slowly toward the property, moving in that same confident way as before, as if the men inside owned the whole road. The man stood on his porch and watched them approach, his expression calm but focused. This time, he wasn't confused or unsure. He knew who they were, what they wanted, and how they operated. And he wasn't facing this alone anymore, not really. Behind him was the weight of the entire road, the stories of his neighbors, and the knowledge that people were counting on him to stay steady. The trucks came to a stop near the end of his driveway, exactly where they had parked last time. Dust rose around the tires before settling again. 4 men stepped out, 3 he recognized from their previous visit, and 1 new face. They wore the same shirts, the same cheap badges, the same stiff posture that tried to mimic authority. He didn't move from the porch at first. He wanted to see what tone they would take this time. Whether they would pretend to be friendly or start with demands. Whether they would try to intimidate him again or attempt to push deeper into the property. The leader, the same man who had spoken before, took slow, deliberate steps toward the gate. He didn't call out a greeting. He didn't smile. He just stared, as if measuring the homeowner's reaction. When he reached the gate, he placed 1 hand on the top bar and leaned on it slightly. "We're back to continue the inspection," the leader said. "We didn't finish last time," the man on the porch answered, with a steady, even voice. "There wasn't a first inspection, and there won't be one today." The leader gave a long, tired sigh, as if he had been expecting this answer. "We already explained the situation. The new regulations applied to every property in this area. You can't just refuse and pretend the rules don't exist." The homeowner kept his eyes on the group. "There are no new regulations. You're not real officials. There is no HOA here. You know that, and I know that."
One of the men behind the leader
shifted his weight, muttering something under his breath. The leader shot him a glance to quiet him. "Sir," the leader said, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. We have authority to ensure compliance." "You don't," the man replied calmly. "You have no right to be here," the leader smirked. But it was a strained smirk this time, not the relaxed, confident one he wore before. "Look," he said, "you're new to the area. Maybe you don't understand how things work out here." "I understand perfectly," the homeowner said. "I've talked to the people around here, and you've been bothering them too." That made the leader pause. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of what to say. The homeowner continued, "You showed up at the older woman's home. You took pictures at another property. You demanded money from a neighbor. You pressured people, knowing they didn't know how to push back." The men behind the leader shifted uncomfortably. Something in their expressions flickered surprise, annoyance, maybe even a little fear. They hadn't expected anyone to talk openly about their actions. The leader straightened his posture. "People misunderstand things sometimes," he said. "We're trying to keep the neighborhood up to standards. That's all." "No," the homeowner replied. "You're trying to scam people. And you're doing it dressed like officials, hoping someone won't question you." The leader exhaled slowly through his nose. "If you're trying to create a problem for yourself," he said, "you're doing a good job." "I'm not creating anything," the homeowner said. "I'm protecting my property. And soon enough, the sheriff will know what's going on. You should leave now, before you make things worse." The leader took a small step forward. "Are you threatening us?" "No," the man replied gently. "I'm telling you the truth. There are enough witnesses now to show you're pretending to be something you're not. And if you keep pushing, it won't end well for you." The new guy, the one who hadn't been with them before, finally spoke. "Maybe we should just go," he said quietly to the leader. "This place isn't worth the trouble." The leader whipped his head around. "We're not leaving because someone asked nicely," he snapped. "We have a job to do." The homeowner watched this exchange carefully. He could see small cracks forming in their confidence. The group wasn't as united as they pretended to be. Some were growing uneasy. This wasn't going according to their usual plan. They didn't know how to handle resistance from someone who wasn't intimidated. The leader turned back toward the porch. "Last chance," he said firmly. "Let us complete the inspection. It will go faster if you cooperate." "No," the homeowner repeated calmly. "You're not stepping onto my property." For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, as if everything was balanced on a thin line that could be broken with one wrong word. The men looked at one another, waiting for someone else to make the next move. Finally, the leader released a quiet growl of frustration. "Fine," he said. "We'll be back with written notices. You'll see the fees yourself." The homeowner didn't flinch. "You can print whatever you want," he said. "It won't make any of it real." The leader pointed a finger at him, as if trying to deliver some final word of authority, but he didn't say anything. He simply dropped his hand, turned sharply, and walked back to the truck. The others followed, though the new member hesitated for a moment before joining them. He looked back at the homeowner with an expression that almost resembled guilt, then climbed into the truck without a word. When the engine started again, the trucks backed up slowly, turned around, and began driving down the road. The men stared through the windows, some frustrated, some shaken, some simply confused by how differently things had gone this time. The homeowner didn't move until the trucks disappeared completely around the bend. Only then did he exhale a slow, steady breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The yard felt quiet again. It wasn't the same peaceful quiet he once knew. Now it felt tense, filled with the weight of what had just happened and the uncertainty of what would happen next. He knew they weren't done. People who acted that boldly rarely gave up after being challenged. But he also knew something else. The fear they relied on was slipping away. Word would spread among the neighbors about today's encounter. People would feel braver, knowing someone had stood firm. And the fake patrol would sense that shift. Bullies always did. Later that afternoon, he walked down the road to check on a few neighbors who lived closest to him. He wanted them to hear directly what had happened, not through bits of gossip or assumptions. When he told them the story, they listened with wide eyes, some shocked, some relieved. "You stood up to them?" one neighbor asked. "By yourself?" he nodded. "I just told them the truth, and they left. At least for today," another neighbor said. "They'll be angry. They don't like being challenged." "Maybe," he replied, "but they won't find this area as easy as they thought." The neighbors seemed reassured by his calmness. They gathered around him, asking questions, sharing their concerns, offering ideas. Some talked about putting up cameras. Others talked about writing official complaints as a group. One even suggested organizing a neighborhood watch, something informal but consistent enough to keep an eye on the road. The homeowner didn't dismiss any ideas. He listened carefully, offering thoughtful responses and encouraging everyone to stay united. He knew that was the key. The fake patrol thrived when people felt isolated. But now the community wasn't isolated, not anymore. By evening, he found himself back on the porch again. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard. The air felt cool and quiet. He looked at the horizon, thinking about what the next days might bring. He imagined the fake patrol sitting somewhere, arguing among themselves about what happened. Maybe the leader was angry. Maybe the others were questioning whether this job was worth the effort. Maybe they were planning their next move. He wished he could believe they would give up. But something in him knew better. They would come back eventually, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to reclaim whatever pride they thought they lost today. People like them didn't like losing control, but he wasn't scared. He was cautious, yes, but not afraid. He had the trust of the neighbors behind him now, and he had the truth on his side. No matter what the fake patrol tried next, they couldn't change those facts. That night, as darkness settled over the yard and the trees whispered gently in the wind, he made himself a quiet promise. He wouldn't let fear take root here. Not in his home. Not in his neighbors' homes. Not on this peaceful road, and no matter how many times the fake patrol returned, they would never find the fear they were searching for, because the community had woken up, and he was ready for whatever came. The next morning arrived quietly, but something about that silence felt heavier than the usual calm that hung over the neighborhood. It was the kind of stillness that made a person feel watched even when no one was around. He stepped outside with a cup of tea in his hand, hoping the fresh air would clear the worries sitting in the back of his mind. But as soon as he walked toward his driveway, he noticed the same unfamiliar car from the previous day parked along the curb again. It sat there with its windows dark, engine off, and no visible movement inside. It wasn't illegal for someone to park on a public street, but the timing made it suspicious. For the past week, he had been trying to understand what these so-called patrol members wanted from him. Each step forward only seemed to lead to another confusing turn. Now the presence of that car felt like a quiet reminder that their activity hadn't ended. It had only shifted. He stood at the edge of his driveway for a moment, pretending to focus on small cracks in the pavement while keeping the car in the corner of his eye. The neighborhood was waking up, doors opening, sprinklers clicking on, the soft sound of someone walking a dog. Everything around him appeared normal, yet he couldn't shake the sense that someone was intentionally trying to unsettle him. When he finished his tea, he headed inside, reminding himself that until someone broke an actual law, all he could do was observe. He turned on the kitchen light and placed the empty cup in the sink. While he washed it, a thought crept in. Maybe the people behind the fake patrol had realized their bluff wasn't working. Maybe now they were trying a different kind of pressure, subtle presence, repeated appearances. Small things meant to wear someone down. He took a slow breath and reminded himself of the truth. He hadn't done anything wrong. These people had no authority over him. Everything they had attempted so far was rooted in intimidation, not legality. And intimidation only worked if someone allowed it. Still, he couldn't ignore what had happened the night before. The way the group had acted bold, but hesitant at the same time, like they were hoping he wouldn't ask the questions he asked. Their confidence had cracks in it, and cracks meant they weren't as powerful as they pretended. Later that afternoon, he received a call from his neighbor across the street, an older man who had lived in the area for decades. He rarely got involved in neighborhood drama, so his call alone hinted that something new had happened. "I saw some people earlier," the neighbor said, his voice low as if someone might overhear. "They were checking mailboxes. Not opening them, just looking like they were comparing addresses against some list. Didn't look right." That small detail changed everything. Checking mailboxes wasn't normal behavior for any real security group. It wasn't normal behavior for anyone except postal workers or residents. That meant whoever these people were, they were extending their reach, looking for something, or trying to make it seem like they had authority they didn't have. "Did they say anything to you?" he asked. "No," the neighbor answered. "They just said they were doing a neighborhood review. But when I asked what organization they were with, they avoided the question." This was the same pattern: big statements, no proof. Bold claims, no identification. A group trying hard to look official while refusing to explain anything official. He thanked his neighbor and hung up the phone. But the gears in his mind were already turning. If these people were comfortable approaching multiple houses, then they weren't acting randomly. They were following some plan or someone's direction. The real question was whether they had targeted the entire neighborhood or just a handful of homes, including his. As the sun began to set, he made his way to his backyard to take a moment to breathe. The sky was changing colors, shifting from soft gold to deep orange. Even with all the recent trouble, the view from his yard always calmed him. It reminded him why he had chosen this place: quiet, open, simple. He sat down and listened to the sound of distant birds settling into their nests. For a few minutes, it almost felt like nothing unusual had happened. But just as he began to relax, he heard the distinct crunch of gravel from the side of his property, the walkway that led from the street to his backyard gate. Footsteps. He turned his head slowly. Through the gaps in the wooden fence, he could see blurry movement shadows shifting, like someone was standing just out of view. Whoever it was seemed to hesitate for a long moment, as if unsure whether to knock or retreat. Finally, cautious tap sounded against the wooden gate. Not loud, almost careful. He rose from the chair and approached the gate with measured steps. When he opened it, he found a woman standing there. She looked nervous, not in the way someone guilty looked, but like someone who had been dragged into something bigger than she agreed to. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly, "but I think I need to tell you something." He recognized her. She lived a few houses down, always kept to herself, always busy with her own life. She wasn't the type to insert herself into neighborhood issues. That made her presence matter even more. Her hand shook slightly as she continued. "I think I made a mistake. The people you ran into? I thought they were real. I thought they were something official. But now, I'm not sure." He let her speak at her own pace. She seemed grateful for that and took a breath before continuing. "They approached me 2 weeks ago," she explained. "They said they were forming a new neighborhood safety group, and they asked if I wanted to help. I never joined, but I signed some form because they said it was just for contact information. Now, I'm starting to think it wasn't something simple." Her voice cracked when she mentioned the form. The worry in her eyes wasn't just for herself. She looked like someone who realized she had unknowingly helped a problem grow. He reassured her gently. "Whatever you signed, it doesn't give them power over you." She nodded but still looked unsure. "I didn't know what they really were," she said. "But today, I overheard them talking near the old park. They weren't checking things for safety. They were talking about people they wanted to push into joining something. They even mentioned you." That last line landed like a stone dropped into still water. "What did they say?" he asked. "They think you're the reason their plan isn't working. They said you're setting a bad example." He felt a strange mix of disbelief and frustration. He wasn't trying to set an example. He was simply refusing to be pushed around. But to a group built on fear and pressure, someone who didn't bend was a threat. The woman looked down, embarrassed. "I'm sorry if anything I signed helped them come after you. I didn't understand. You didn't do anything wrong," he said gently. "You trusted what they told you. Anyone might have." His calm response eased her shoulders a bit. She looked relieved that he wasn't blaming her for something she didn't knowingly support. She glanced down the street and lowered her voice. "I came to tell you because I think they'll try something bigger soon. Not something harmful, just something loud or dramatic to make people think they're officially in charge."
Right.
He thanked her sincerely before she hurried back home, clearly worried about being seen talking to him. When the gate closed behind her, he stood in the fading light for a long time, thinking. He already suspected the group had been building some kind of fake authority. But now he knew they had plans and organization behind their actions. They weren't just a few people pretending to be officials. They were attempting to influence the neighborhood. Step by step, he walked back inside his house and turned on the living room lamp. The warm glow made the room feel safe, familiar, grounded. But underneath that comfort, a new awareness settled in. They weren't going to stop on their own. Not because of him. Not because anyone confronted them. They would keep expanding as long as people believed their act. He sat down and let the truth settle for the first time. He realized he might have to take more than just reactive steps. He might need to protect not only his own peace, but also the peace of people who trusted these imposters without knowing better. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want drama. He didn't want to be part of any confrontation. But he also knew something important. Silence was exactly what these people used to grow. The next step wasn't going to be easy. But it was becoming clear that he wouldn't be able to avoid it much longer, and whatever came next, he would have to face it head-on while keeping everything peaceful, calm, and within the boundaries of the law. Because while the fake patrol relied on appearance, he relied on truth, and truth, when spoken clearly, was louder than intimidation. He leaned back, took a steady breath, and began planning what needed to happen the following day, not with anger, not with fear, but with clarity. The group wanted a show, but he was about to give them something far more powerful. Exposure. The morning he had prepared for arrived quietly, almost too calmly for the kind of day he expected. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in pale colors, and everything felt slow and peaceful. But beneath that calm, he could feel a small weight in his chest, a reminder that this would be the day. Everything finally came into the open. He stepped outside with a notebook in hand, something he rarely carried but now needed. Over the last few days, he had written down everything that had happened. Every visit, every suspicious action, and every moment that didn't sit right. It wasn't meant to accuse anyone. It was simply his way of making sure the truth was organized, clear, and ready to be shared if needed. He looked around the neighborhood. A few people were already outside watering plants, checking their mail, or just enjoying the early breeze. Some waved at him. Others looked curious, almost as if they sensed something was building but didn't know what it was. The last few days had spread whispers. Whispers had a way of traveling faster than facts. He returned the friendly waves and walked toward the end of his driveway. Instead of watching the street for a suspicious car, he watched it for something more telling movement. And sure enough, after only a few minutes, a pair of cars rolled slowly into the neighborhood. They weren't marked, not in any real way, but someone unfamiliar might have mistaken them for official vehicles. That was the trick these people relied on, looking official enough to fool those who didn't. Question things. The cars stopped near the park entrance, and a few individuals stepped out. They wore the same style of clothing he had seen before: arc shirts, matching hats, badges that looked important until you realized they were just shiny pieces of metal with no actual agency behind them. They stood together, talking quietly, glancing around the neighborhood as if surveying their territory. That alone told him everything he needed to know. They were getting ready for whatever big moment they had planned. Something to announce themselves. Something to make people think they were genuine. He took a slow breath and stepped back inside his home for a moment to calm his thoughts. Today wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about fear. It was about clarity, something that imposters could never stand against for long. By mid-morning, more neighbors had gathered near the park, drawn by curiosity. They whispered among themselves, wondering aloud about the people who kept showing up lately. Some seemed nervous, some confused, and a few looked almost convinced by the fake authority the group displayed. That was the reason he couldn't stay silent anymore. Silence gave room for doubt. Doubt gave room for manipulation. He walked over to the group of neighbors and stood among them. They greeted him with nods and soft smiles, clearly relieved to see someone who had already been questioning the situation. "What's going on today?" one neighbor asked quietly. "I'm not sure yet," he answered honestly. "But I think they're trying to make themselves look official again." A few people exchanged uneasy glances. The feeling in the air wasn't exactly far. It was uncertainty. People didn't like being unsure about who held authority, especially in their own neighborhood, where life was supposed to feel simple and predictable. Before any more questions could be asked, the group near the park finally made their move. One of them stepped forward, holding a clipboard, trying his best to appear important. A few others stood behind him with folded arms, forming what looked like a small lineup. "Everyone please gather." The man with the clipboard called out, "We're starting a mandatory neighborhood review." His voice was firm, but shaky at the edges. It's like someone who had practiced a speech but wasn't confident in the message. The neighbors around him looked puzzled. "A review?" someone whispered. "What kind of review? What authority do they have?" Another asked, but the man with the clipboard didn't answer those questions. Instead, he cleared his throat and announced that they would be issuing warnings, checking compliance, and verifying participation in their program. All phrases that sounded serious but didn't mean anything legally. The neighbors didn't move forward. They just looked at one another, confused. He decided this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where clarity could replace intimidation. He stepped forward calmly, making sure his voice carried but didn't rise. "Before anyone participates," he said, "I'd like to ask a simple question." The man with the clipboard paused, visibly annoyed. "What question? What organization are you with?" A few neighbors nodded in agreement. It was a question that should have had an easy answer if the group was genuine. "We're with the Neighborhood Safety Enforcement Group," man replied. "That's not a recognized agency," he said calmly. "Can you show us proper identification?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "We have badges," he said, lifting the shiny emblem clipped to his shirt. "That's not official identification," he replied. "Do you have a permit to conduct a neighborhood review? Any legal documents?" Any certification? One of the neighbors chimed in. Yes. Do you have anything from the county or city? The group members exchanged glances. Their confidence started to slip. Their badges suddenly looked more like decorations than authority. We don't need city documents, the man insisted. We're acting on behalf of the community. Who elected you? He asked gently. Did anyone here vote for you or agree to this program? The neighbors looked around. Not a single hand went up. The man with the clipboard tried a different tactic. We have signatures, he said. From who? Another neighbor asked. I never signed anything. The man hesitated again. His shoulders tightened. This was the moment the truth became visible, not through shouting or confrontation, but through simple questions that exposed the empty structure behind their act. The woman who had visited him the day before stepped forward nervously. They asked me to sign something weeks ago, she said, but they didn't tell me it would be used like this. I thought it was harmless. Several neighbors murmured in agreement, surprised and frustrated. He spoke again, keeping his voice steady. Signing a sheet doesn't give anyone the right to create a false authority over the neighborhood. Another neighbor raised her voice. Are you even allowed to do this? What you're doing seems wrong. The man with the clipboard started to panic. We're trying to help keep order here. We just want cooperation. But you're pretending to be officials, someone else said. That's not keeping order, that's misleading people. The man opened his mouth to respond, but he had nothing left to say. The more the neighbors questioned him, the more the illusion broke. The group had relied on people being quiet, confused, or afraid. But once the questions started, their authority dissolved like sand in water, seeing their plan fall apart. The group tried to retreat quietly, claiming they would return with proper documents. But the neighbors, now confident in the truth, stood firmly. No one of them said, if you come back, it should be with real verification from real authorities. Others nodded. The message was clear. This neighborhood no longer believed in their act. The group had no choice but to leave. They got in their cars and drove out slowly, without the confidence they had arrived with. The neighbors watched them go, finally feeling the pressure lift, as the last car disappeared. A neighbor turned to him with a grateful smile. Thank you, they said softly. We didn't realize how far this had gone. He shook his head. You don't have to thank me. We just needed to ask the right questions, another neighbor added. It's a good reminder that things aren't always what they look like. People began talking among themselves, relieved and more connected than they had been in a long time. Without meaning to, he had helped bring the neighborhood together, not through force or authority, but through honesty and calm questions. Later, when the crowd slowly dispersed and the neighborhood returned to its normal, peaceful rhythm, he walked back home feeling lighter, for the first time in weeks. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't search for unfamiliar cars. He didn't wait for someone in a fake uniform to appear. He stood on his porch, took a deep breath, and felt the quiet settle gently around him, not the heavy silence of uncertainty, but the calm silence of peace returning. The sun was setting behind the rooftops, painting the sky in warm colors. He watched it for a long moment, feeling grateful that everything had ended without harm, without chaos, and without fear. It ended because the truth had spoken louder than the act these people had tried to put on. And in the end, that truth didn't just protect him, it protected the entire neighborhood as he stepped inside and closed the door. He felt something he hadn't felt in days, relief, and the peaceful certainty that sometimes standing firm with simple honesty is stronger than anything someone can pretend to be.